My Aunt Barbara has died, peacefully and quietly, with a smile on her lips, at the age of 95. She remained alert and lively to the last, surrounded by her family, remembering the good times, and occasionally reminding those who had failed to do so themselves, until eventually weariness and renal failure took her gently away, as all of us would wish to go. Barbara was born in Burma, in the hill station of Mamio. She was delivered into the Mikado family, and in childhood was moved with her siblings to Calcutta to live with various uncles and aunts. The arrival of this fascinating creature as the latest addition to the family, through her marriage to my uncle Roland, was a welcome respite from the routine into which our lives had settled in this remote bungalow we lived in the foothills of the Himalayas during part of World War II. When I met her, during the early years of that war, Mamio had fallen into Japanese hands. She had met my Uncle Roland, Watson, in Calcutta, where she was a nursing cadet, and he was completing his stay at medical college. In order to marry him, she became, as often happens in such cases, a fanatical convert to Catholicism. But this did nothing to dissipate a puckish sense of humour that made her seem more a big sister to us than an aunt. She won our respect and gratitude by defying my grandmother's prohibition on the opening of windows at night, convincing her it was unhealthy to sleep in airless rooms, and that despite whatever rudimentary climbing skills they might possess, snakes were unlikely to climb brick walls. Nevertheless, Nana insisted that the barriers of newspaper remain under the doors. Uncle Rowley was by now in uniform as an officer in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he and Aunt Barbara were posted to Lucknow, where they would be living some distance out of town. My younger brother Paul and I were sent to St. Francis College in Lucknow, reputedly one of the best in India. However, St. Francis was a residential school, and though Rowley and Barbara might be able to visit us at weekends and take us home with them perhaps once a month, we would have to be admitted as boarders. I will remember those longed-for weekend breaks at the Watson household in Dinky Cot, as the bungalow is called. There already Barbara had embarked upon a collection of dogs and birds. You could never be bored in her company. There were always things to do, sunsets to photograph, stamps to collect, letters to write, and the stories. I wish I could remember all of them, but I do remember some. Attached to the staff of a nursing home in the foothills of the Himalayas, she recalled watching from the kitchen window as a local Indian baker wound his way uphill along the footpath from the gate, with a basket of loaves balanced on his head. Suddenly she was aware, as was the baker, that he was being pursued by one of the patients in pyjamas, unsuccessfully trying to conceal himself behind clumps of shrubbery. The baker quickened his pace, as did his pursuer, till eventually both basket and loaves were abandoned, and the baker flung himself around a corner of the building, only to find himself in a walled garden with no other means of exit. Sinking to his knees, ready to surrender his soul to his Hindu makers, the baker closed his eyes as his pyjama-clad stalker raced up to him. "Last touch," yelled the patient, tapping the baker on the shoulder and turning on his heels to race off again. "You're it," he breathlessly yelled to the huddled form collapsed against the dead end of the garden wall. When our lives in India came to an end in 1946, on the eve of India's independence the following year, most of us Watsons parted company, dispersed in various directions. Their tours of army duty made it difficult to keep up with Barbara and Rowley, but my next most vivid recollection of them came during my first spell of home leave from Malaya in 1961. Up the road from my parents' house at Old Harrow Road in Hastings, Barbara and Rowley had taken up temporary rented accommodation, which they would occupy only until Rowley's next overseas posting. By now, Rowley was one of the military's leading authorities on sexually transmitted diseases. As its name implied, Diodone was indeed a God-given resting place, a rambling bungalow with a spacious garden, reminiscent of the many we had known in India. It became the hub of Watson family reunions that embraced much of our clan, including, of course, my parents and Uncle Len and Zena, who were awaiting Len's next Royal Signals Regiment posting. Rowley and Barbara hosted great garden parties where we revived the games we had loved from our Indian past. Charades and treasure hunts, obstacle courses, and that good old standby, the Tinkerary Man, where we would all elect my musical instruments and be eliminated one by one for failing to switch in time. For me, Barbara's most endearing trait was her refusal to conform. The higher her husband was promoted through the ranks, until he became a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Army Medical Corps, the greater her disdain for playing the role of the officer's wife. If she was going to entertain, she would do so not in the company of fellow officers' wives, but with the rank and file. She was happier with the families of nurses and hospital orderlies than she could ever be in the calling card and afternoon tea set. I suspect she deliberately thumbed her nose at the upper classes. Whereas other officers' wives might have chauffeur-driven limousines arrive to take them out shopping, Barbara would trundle her battered old pram down the road to the local store, deliberately choosing to wear apparel chosen for comfort rather than elegance. I could imagine the shocked expressions behind partly drawn curtains as she flaunted her scorn for setting a good example. As a self-confessed traditionalist, Barbara hated the reform which overtook the Catholic Church as a result of the Second Vatican Council. To her it seemed appalling that churches are abandoning the Latin Mass and dispensing with their statues of saints in favor of severely modernist interiors. She went around collecting these discarded statues, many of them life-size, which she housed in the tiny bungalow she occupied after her husband died. I well remember the first night I spent with her there. Disconcerted by the queue that had seemingly formed in the darkened corridor leading to the toilet, I wondered why all these people were so silent, and whether they were refugees to whom my ever-charitable aunt had decided to offer bed and board along with the cats and the dogs. Increasingly uncomfortable at the prospect of a long wait, I tapped the next figure on the shoulder, only to discover I was knocking on wood. My complaint over breakfast the next morning at having to queue behind my sainted namesake had Aunt Barbara in stitches. It became familiar routine for me to anticipate that on further visits all hell would break loose inside when I rang the doorbell. There would be the crashing sounds of one-eyed dogs colliding with three-legged dogs, and an entire aviary of variegated birds would be in full chorus, until eventually my aunt or her son Nick would calm things down and answer the door. What happens, I wonder, when my dear Aunt Barbara arrives, as it were, up there to join the actual saints, whose effigies she has so lovingly preserved? I would like to think she is welcomed as my very own sainted aunt.